Beginning with our second speaker, and I'm thrilled to welcome our overseas guest, Dr. Anja Siegemund, who is the director of the Centrum Judaicum in Berlin, a museum and cultural centre that's also the repository of the archival documents that Joachim Schlör has drawn on for the publication of this book. Dr. Siegemund began her research career at the University of Munich, where she studied German-speaking Zionists in Palestine and Israel and their attitudes towards the emerging Arab-Israeli conflict. She was later the head of the Jerusalem branch of the Leobeck Institute, which is the central institution for the preservation and documentation of German Jewish cultural heritage. In 2016, she edited a volume on German and Central European Jews, cultural transfers, life worlds and identities in the city of Haifa. Professor Joachim Schlör, to whom I'll hand over in just a moment, has been Professor of Modern Jewish, Non-Jewish Relations and a member of the Parks Institute at the University of Southampton for several years, having undertaken his academic training in Germany. Joachim's work focuses on the history of urban life and of migration and mobility, with a particular interest in how these things are reflected in individual experience. So this is not the first time that Professor Schlör has published a work based on personal documents such as letters, diaries, and photo albums of emigrant German Jews. In 2020, he published the English translation of his book on Baroness Julia Neuberger's mother, Liesl Rosenthal, who came to Britain in 1937, published under the title Escaping Nazi Germany, One Woman's Emigration from Heilbronn to England. Professor Schlör will now deliver a talk for us entitled I have often been back to Berlin and think of the city as mine. So Joachim, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Joan and Claire as well for hosting this. Funny to be back in Southampton during my research leave. The most difficult thing is always trying to share the screen, but I hope this will work. Can somebody tell me if you can see it?
Yes, Joachim, we can see that.
All right. So this is indeed a topic that has been very close to my heart for many years, and I've started to write about it after I first came to Israel, to the University of Tel Aviv in the early 1990s. And it was October, and it was a very warm day, Herzen, so about 40 degrees. But I was invited by a German couple who had emigrated in the 1930s, and the lady served hot roast with potatoes because in her mental calendar it was already October, and this feeling, this ambivalence between what they had brought with them from Germany and their new life in Israel was something that had fascinated me really for a long time. And as Joan said, I have collected documents, letters, photographs, mostly by private people. So not the classical archival material by communities and then institutions that goes into archives, but family memoirs. And in recent years, obviously, many of us who deal with this kind of story have realized that there's a transition going on at the moment between those who went through the experience themselves and their children and grandchildren. So kind of transition also of documents in the best case. In many cases, documents have also been lost. And somehow I've started to assemble my own archive and have written about several aspects of it. As Joan mentioned, I was really fascinated by the idea of the letter written in emigration. This is a difficult topic because there's censorship. There are often family tensions, difficult family relations when one member of the family, as in the case of that last book, a young woman, Liesl Rosenthal, leaves her hometown and manages to arrive in England, find a job, create a circle of friends. And her mother tries to hold on to her authority over the child by sending daily postcards and letters from Germany. Other people, such as our former colleague Shirley Gilbert or Esther Saraga, have also written about such family letters in the emigration process. with the new project, I have moved a little bit forward, and it's really thanks to Anja Siegemund's institution, the Stiftung Neue Synagoge Centrum Judaicum in Berlin, which has an amazing archive. And among these archival documents is a set of correspondence that I was the first to be able to look at. And the book and this presentation as well is based on this collection. Several hundred, I haven't counted them, but several hundreds of letters that were written in the early 1990s by so-called former Berliners, maybe one of the notions we can discuss later, from really all across the globe, from Melbourne and Sydney, from Cape Town and Johannesburg, from Buenos Aires and Rio de Janeiro, from Chicago and New York, and even from an Arctic research station, and all of them in dialogue with the city where their families came from, where their families had lived for a certain period, and to which they feel in different ways connected. Now, in these early 1990s, the Senate of Berlin, the local government, has decided to produce a memorial book for the murdered Jews of Berlin, the victims of the Holocaust in Berlin, and set up a working group led by Klaus Sühl with 2 more members. And they went to the archives. They did all the things the historian has to do by compiling such a sad volume. But they also published a call, which you can see here on the bottom of the right-hand side, Aufruf an Berliner, asking those who have managed to escape Nazi Germany and who ended up in emigration destinations all over the world to provide the group with information about relatives, family members who had perished in the Holocaust. Overall, the response was overwhelming. And not only in the sense that most of them were prepared to provide this information, but also in the sense that they said, we have our own stories to tell. We have to tell stories about emigration, how we managed to get out of Germany, how we followed all these difficult steps of applying for visa and going to consulates and getting a kind of new geographical picture of the world. Where can I go? Where is my profession of use? Does Palestine make sense in a situation of crisis? Does South America make sense? And so on. And so they fulfilled the first function, provided information about the fate of Jewish Berliners, like in this case, Heinz and Ilse Abrams in Australia, who say here, dear Dr. Sühl, we heard from friends that you look for information about Jews who lived in Berlin between 1933 and 1945. As far as we could remember, we have written up the names. And they sent, copied 2 pages here. I think overall it's an 8-page letter with addresses from people who just went to Australia. That was the function, the intended function, say, that was what the working group expected. What they did not expect was the load of documents that were sent along, letters, postcards, diaries, photographs and whole photo albums, memoirs, poems. And the problem in a way is this was a very lively discussion that emerged when the group finally realized what a treasure they got there. It took them a long time to respond to people and to realize that with their initiative, with that call, they had started a process that they couldn't control anymore in a way. It went far above the initial plans. So we have a kind of emerging, growing personal relationship between some of the members of the team and some of those German Jews in emigration who obviously wanted a response again and wanted to make sure that the documents and the information they sent was well received and so on. But obviously, this is not really an archive. This is a working group set up by the Senate with a clear task. So after they finished and the memorial book was published, all this disappeared in the archives. Luckily, in the archive of the Centrum Judaicum, where I then could see them. There are just two examples. One is a confirmation written by the Hitachut Olei Germania, the Olei Austria, the Association of Immigrants from Germany and from Austria in 1939, confirming that Mr. Moshe Gottlieb in Haifa fulfills all that is required to get a certificate for the immigration for his whole family and to come to Haifa. The other one is a postcard sent from the ship Bremen on its way to Shanghai. Yeah, so just two examples of the kind of documents that could be found there. Not from the collection, but this one emerged in my discussions with the archivists at Centrum Judaicum. Anna Fischer's own family gave me this beautiful photo album where 2 pages just, it says, "Es war im schönen Monat Mai." That's a German folk song. It was in the beautiful month of May. And it looks like a normal photo album. It's only the year 1939 that makes us aware of the situation which these people must have found themselves in. And the next page then says, "Wir fahren in die Welt." We travel into the world, if you translate it directly, all across the world. For example, Inge Fischer, the only one in her family, was able to emigrate from Germany in the center. 2 ladies they had in the train station in Berlin on the day of her departure to London in 1939, and saying goodbye to other family members over a long period, starting maybe in 1936, and then 39 finally, Inge at least managed to get out of Germany and to arrive in England. This one is from a different archive, from the Academy of Arts, but I choose it, we choose it as the title for the book, where the artist Fritz Halbers paints the view from his flat in Berlin-Charlottenburg, Nürnberger Straße 65, looking out of the window into a peaceful pastoral scene that meant Berlin for him, that symbolized Berlin for him. But when you turn the picture around on the back, you can see the description. This is where I lived before 1933 as an actor and then a painter. And then you see 2 stamps close to the bottom. So you have the German address again, Nürnberger Straße 65, but then a stamp from New York and another one from Cordoba. He emigrated, so did the picture. I could never talk to him, but I have his picture that tells me where he went. So the document is a container of meaning, a container of stories, a container of memory, if we are able to read it and find out more about it. Another fascinating document that I found in the archives of the Jewish Museum in Berlin is this drawing by Fritz Freudenheim. And just the day before yesterday, I had an email exchange with his widow, Irene Freudenheim, who is still alive at 90, and has to give permission for the publication of this picture. And we started talking and exchanging stories. And Fritz, as a boy, painted 2 voyages in one. The first one on the upper level is by train from Berlin, southwest, hard to read, 82 or something, to Hamburg. So there is a kind of family experience with voyages, but then they return to Berlin, as you can see in the upper right-hand side, and then they go again to Hamburg in October 1938, and they take a ship, and that ship moves them, and they move with the ship to South America. What I find fascinating in the context of geographical imagination, that the rest of the world is rather small. I mean, Germany is larger than Africa. There's no Palestine, interestingly, but the stations where the ship moved along Antwerp in Belgium, Le Havre in Paris, Lisbon in Portugal, Casablanca, then finally in North Africa. And then it moves across the Atlantic Ocean, and then we get very concrete. So the map of South America is really perfect. This is the new Heimat, the new homeland that he now has to live in, identify himself with, find his feet somehow together with his family. And there's another address now, Calle Sotelo, in Montevideo. I come to that point a little bit later. There's a very interesting group on Facebook. So obviously, social media has many functions, many bad ones, but in this case, I think it's a very good one, because they host a group that has been set up by a lady from Boston, Vera Meyer, whose parents were from Germany. She was born in 1950, and she inaugurated that group that they call Jews, Jekes, which is the colloquial name for German Jews, particularly those in immigration, who still have a kind of connection to Germany. Another point we can truly discuss how important that point is for their lives today. And people exchange information about their families, about trips to Germany, about the question if they should appeal for German citizenship again, about the laying of the so-called Stolpersteine, little stumbling stones in the front of the street that bear the names of Jews who were deported from Berlin, from these houses, not only Berlin, many other places in Germany and across Europe in the meantime. They send in documents and ask people to help them translate them or decipher them when they're written in Old German. And they also send in family photos. So in a way, this site has become an archive, not accessible to everybody, but accessible, for example, to me, since I'm a member of that group and support people when they have questions. And one of the active members there is Bridget King, who herself lives in Germany again, and she posted this wonderful photograph of Dr. Sam Licht in his studio on Brückenstraße in Berlin. And she told me that the photograph was still in the possession of her father, Dr. Peter King, who was a medieval historian at the University of St. Andrews. So I went up to St. Andrews and visited him. And we started talking about the photographs, the memories. He was 4-year-old when he came to England in 1933, so born 1929. And I just put up 2 quotations here because they illustrate maybe this tension within which these people live. In 1945, at the age of 16, my feelings were that I was British. But very strangely, I think of Berlin as home. I think this is where I belong. And then he corrected himself and said, well, where I come from. And I think this really illustrates very well the emotional tension that is there, and that's symbolized by these pictures from Berlin that are still in his possession. The document that I found maybe the most fascinating of them all is a letter that had been written a little bit before the book on the work, the memorial book started, written in 1987 when the city of Berlin celebrated its 1200th birthday. Sorry, its 750th birthday. The first mentioning of the name of the city of Berlin in 1237. And he wrote that letter in 1987, but he sent it again as part of that correspondence that started in 1991, and it's a letter directed to the city of Berlin. Liebes Berlin, dear Berlin. He congratulates to that 750th birthday very cordially. He sends his best wishes. He expresses his gratitude for a present. The city regularly sent out calendars and booklets to those former Berliners. Often with photographs that showed, as he writes in the letter, your old places, Berlin, which I all recognized well. Then he goes on to say that emotions or understanding cannot always be easily expressed or taken into consideration in such a correspondence, which for me translates into it didn't receive a response to that or any other letter, only when the working group then really began its work. But he would like to say his letter forwarded to the mayor and the speaker of the Senate because he found it so important that these people should know what happened to him and his family. So I quote the middle part, Berlin. In truth, we have done such a sinister injustice to my young parents and very many of my relatives. How can I ever forgive you? Had it just happened to me, it might be easier. But when I think of the piled up mountains of bones of those perished and innocent people, among them my parents and my parents-in-law, I ask, not myself, but the memory of my mother and my father who loved you so profoundly and whom you have yet betrayed. Mom, Dad, your Berlin sends signals that it seems to, that it seems to wish that what has happened had not happened. What shall I do? What would you have done? I would follow your wish. And this goes on for 6 or 7 pages, expressing all the emotions concerned here. The next document is again something that I really found fascinating. It's a school essay written on the 9th of November, interestingly, 1937, so 1 year before so-called Kristallnacht. Kann uns zum Vaterland die Fremde werden? Gedanken zur heutigen jüdischen Lage. Can a strange land become a new fatherland? Thoughts on today's Jewish situation. And I mean, he's a pupil at the private Kaliski school in Berlin-Dahlem, and he writes an essay about something that will happen to him very shortly. So it's not a theoretical deliberation. Can a strange land become a home? But it is really the question that he has to find out an answer for himself. And this brings me to an unexpected link to my own university, our own university. Landsberg was born in Berlin on August 8, 1922, into an educated secular Jewish family. Despite the early death of his father, his childhood was happy until the Nazis came to power. In January 1939, at the age of 16, he left for Britain to join his brother. He studied, made a career as a scientist. He was appointed professor of applied mathematics first at University College Cardiff, and then in 1972 he moved to the chair of applied mathematics at the University of Southampton, retiring in 1987. And when I asked Tony Kushner some years ago if he ever heard the name of Peter Theodor Landsberg, he said, yes, I think I have a document, and fortunately he found it, a letter written by Theodor Landsberg in 1993, so exactly at the time the memorial book was produced. A letter to his grandson in which he explains the un-British name of Landsberg and how this all has happened. And he says, for our particular family group, it was I who introduced his name to this country. By coming here in the late 1930s, I was what people called a refugee from Nazi oppression. And he goes on. Thus, at the age of 16, I found myself in England with the financial support of my mother's brother, who had emigrated earlier to Brazil. My older brother was studying in London, but I was essentially alone. An insignificant seedling of German Jewish culture had dropped upon the green pastures of England. Would it take? Actually, you, John, lucky fellow, are one of the proofs. He also discusses World War I and the fact that his grandson's forefathers had stood on the other side. So he enters into this dialogue about the past and the present and the two countries with the next generation with his grandson, which I find again a very interesting element of that story. There is a period in which the middle generation, say the second generation, is just busy, building up their professional lives, building up the state of Israel and so on. And it's really third generation that today, or since 20 years or so maybe, comes back to ask questions about the family story. And finally, here on the right-hand side, you see Peter Theodor Landsberg then visiting the place of his former school, Kaliski School in Berlin, where today we find this memorial plaque. So a story that's connected to Southampton. The Senate of Berlin was not the only institution that invited emigrants, former Berliners. The Academy of Arts in 1992 housed an exhibition on the Jüdische Kulturbund. This is a problematic institution, one might say, created by the Nazis, created under Nazi control for Jewish actors, artists who could not work publicly anymore, who could not play on a German stage anymore or in a German movie. And so created a kind of ghetto-like situation for a number of years until 1938. Mostly, some of them really stayed in Berlin in order to support this and in order to use this protected and controlled inner Jewish space, what one could say, or other people have said, instead of emigrating, instead of trying to get away as quickly as possible. So they set up an exhibition in 1992 and invited former members of the Kulturbund to come and see the exhibition. Of course, again, with the idea also to donate their documents. And there's another set of correspondence in the archives of the Jüdische Kulturbund where people start asking questions. Should I really send these documents or even my instrument back to Berlin? What will happen this time? Will you care for it? This is there, but at the same time, there's a big interest in Berlin. So we have this typically Berlinish picture for the last, 30 years or so, building and rebuilding and reconstructing the city after the fall of the wall. And of course, these people are very interested. It is, in a way, their city. So going through the letters, you find a huge mosaic of ambivalence. And the question that has been asked in most of these letters, questionnaires, what is your relationship to Berlin? And I just, from thousands, I just quote a couple. Homesickness. I was born in Berlin and lived there up to my 26th year, so I got my intellectual character from kindergarten to university in Berlin. Berlin is mine, my father's birthplace and home. My grandparents and great-grandparents also lived there. Unfortunately, I don't live there anymore because friends and relatives perished in the Holocaust. My reference is in the cemetery, the Jewish cemetery of Weißensee. My grandparents are buried there. Only in thoughts, very sad. After all, I lost my parents there. And finally, I've been to Berlin many times and think of the city as mine. In preparation of this, Munitza has asked me, what is so specific about Berlin? And obviously, I've been writing about Berlin a lot. It is true, other cities have similar correspondences, similar programs to invite former citizens of Hamburg, of Munich, of Frankfurt. There's a very interesting PhD dissertation turned into a book, Berliner Niku, on these organized visits. Or when the Jeckes meet for a Stammtisch, for regular meetings online, they discuss their lives in Washington Heights, the role of the Aufbau, as Atina Grossman has said, the Family Bible, this German Jewish newspaper produced in New York. One of the very active and very impressive members is Dr. Ruth Westheimer, the famous sexologist, who will really use every opportunity to quote, and I do it in German first, und es will man nicht in der Kopenai, wie kann ein Mensch nicht von Frankfurt sei? How can anybody not be from Frankfurt? So we have these connections, very obviously, to other cities as well. But of course, Berlin was the home of the largest Jewish community in Germany, home to its most important institutions, central place of all Jewish fantasies from assimilation following the Enlightenment to Zionism before 1933. And even more so after the Nazis' rise to power, when many Jews from smaller German towns tried to move to Berlin because they thought it was a more secure place, particularly for families with an East German or East European background. Berlin symbolized arrival in the modern world. And, which is often emphasized, the city never voted in a majority for the Nazis in free elections up to March 1933. And still today, many people will make a difference between Germany and Berlin. I would never go to Germany, but if my son or my grandson wants to study in Berlin, that's fine. In the same way, maybe that New York is not the USA and Shanghai is not China. Berlin is both a village. They all know each other. Most of them know each other and have contacts in different ways, but also part of the wider world at the same time. So very quickly, I had hundreds of letters before me, and I thought it would be useful to introduce the book with a short history of this assumed particular relationship between Berlin and its Jewish community, to add a short literary history of what Peter Gay has termed the Berlin Jewish spirit, and the subtitle of his famous 1972 lecture was, of course, A Dogma in Search of Some Doubt. People maybe too quickly talk about the Berlin Jewish spirit, a certain mentality, a certain attitude, a certain quickness in language, a certain humor maybe, that he admits was there, but it was there amid, in the midst of a lot of conflict, of course, of anti-Semitism, of inner Jewish tension. So maybe a too beautiful picture often painted about this particular relationship. And then I thought it would not make sense to try and bring a system into these letters, to force my categories on them. So I went through them alphabetically, quoting from them now and again, in order to maintain the fragmented character of the correspondence. Not everybody has responded to the call. Not everybody has seen the call. People have responded also negatively. Why do you contact me? Why do you open up wounds that have partly healed? And why do you remember now of this again? This is a small minority, but it's there and needs to be considered. And I also added information on the political background in the early 1990s. The book was finally produced in 1995. 1989, the Berlin Wall falls. Next year, German reunification and a big euphoria on the one hand, but also news about xenophobia, changes in the laws on asylum seekers. A strange mixture of a controlled nationalism, at least as I saw it, controlled euphoria, but you see these people standing on the Berlin Wall on the night of, again, November 9, 1989, but on the other hand, news about attacks against Vietnamese contract workers, against asylum seekers, against Turks who had been living in Germany for a long time, and that was in the western part of my country. And of course, these news were read and registered by these people in Buenos Aires and in Melbourne, and they would ask, is it safe to come? Have you not learned a lesson? So this is also really part of the story. Another context that we can surely discuss, this is not the first group of German Jews who left the country. We have German Jewish communities emerging in the mid-19th century in the United States after the failed German Revolution of 1848, motivated, like all immigrants, by hopes for a better life. This is part of the Facebook group as well, so some people have really moved there long before and feel that connection still. Second point, although Zionism as a political movement was partly, not party, German-speaking, Theodor Herzl's work has been published in German, obviously. Only about 2,000, maybe 2,500 German Jews emigrated to Palestine before 1933. Important people among them, Gershom Scholem, the medical doctor Auerbach, but most of them really came after 1933 and not so much out of Zionist conviction, but in order to get out of Germany. So in that period after 1933, new centers of German Jewish emigre communities emerged in the United States with about 140,000 people. The UK about 80,000, Palestine about maybe 55 to 60,000, Argentina 30,000, and in smaller numbers in Australia, South Africa, the Caribbean, Shanghai, and other places across the globe. Is this a diaspora? I don't know. Is German Jewish diaspora a good notion? Hopefully that's also something we can discuss. So to conclude, obviously I'm by far not the first who felt that this heritage of the German Jews, of their language, their literary, musical, in general cultural interests, their entrepreneurship, their connectedness to Germany has been researched. As early as the 1940s, German Jewish emigrants made attempts to transfer Jewish institutions such as the Hochschule für die Wissenschaft des Judentums from the German Reich and continue to make them accessible for research. With the end of the Second World War and the awareness of the Holocaust, these efforts took on a new dimension. The basic assumption put into words by the gentleman you see on the left-hand side, Rabbi Leobeck. Basic assumption was that German Jewish history was irrevocably over. Considerations about the preservation of knowledge, like the science of Judaism, had a double function: research and memorialization of a German Jewish history that was completed. So they founded the Leobeck Institute of Jews from Germany in order to keep alive, revive, and deepen the memory of German Judaism and other parts of Central European Judaism through research, cultural and historical sociological nature, publications. For example, a yearbook they thought maybe in 5 or 6 volumes that would then complete German Jewish history. Obviously, the history has been going on. The yearbook is at issue 83 or something in the meantime. There's a Leobeck Institute, as has been mentioned, in Jerusalem, another one in London. The largest archive is, I think, the one in New York, which has a huge memoir collection. So has been more open for family papers, memoirs than, for example, the Central Zionist Archives in Jerusalem. But truly, my story, or the story I've been trying to write, has to be read also in that context. And to conclude, I've mentioned it before, on a lower level, not that of the archives and not of the state institutions, memory work is also going on an individual level and a transgenerational level. And I just quote from the introduction to the Facebook site that I've mentioned. Jecke means German Jew. For our purposes here, we expand the definition to include Jews from any German-speaking area. This group is created with the hope of finding and networking with all those with this background who self-identify as Jeckes. My mother was from Berlin, my dad was from Bielefeld. Many of our members had parents who survived the war and were raised as Jews in a place where German was the primary language. We now welcome them and their offspring to join us to honor our families and Jecke heritage. And they also refer to those who arrived in the 19th century and are obviously also welcome. So the discussion in a way is going on. I've caught it at a moment in time in the early 1990s under very specific circumstances, but obviously this is still ongoing work. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joachim, for that fascinating presentation. So a virtual round of applause. Thank you.
I do really think there is a kind of danger of appropriation in a certain way, that we look at the Germanness of these people more, because obviously these are the people we can meet and talk to, and they like to speak German, and they know all the classical German literature, and we feel connected. This is what happened to me when I was in Israel. But we have to take into consideration that they have become Israelis or Americans or Argentinians or Australians, at least at the same time. They do carry this cultural heritage, which maybe is a better word than diaspora. They feel connected. In some cases, they find it useful to apply for German citizenship so that their children can work within the European Union. Do I have to explain this notion? Have a passport. That's all, really a technical function. But what we should try to avoid is to try and make them more German as they really have become. They have become Israelis. They have learned Hebrew. Their children obviously speak Hebrew. There is an interest in the German aspect, in the German side, that should be cherished and maybe even celebrated. They have created little Berlins or little Frankfurts or little whatevers through coffee houses and newspaper readings and regular meetings. But then they go out on the street and speak Hebrew again. It's interesting that the third generation, maybe now in the meantime even the fourth, does still feel a connection. When you think of the movie The Apartment, where somebody goes to his grandparents' apartment in Tel Aviv, which is being cleared out after their death, and he finds a lot of documents, and what he immediately intends to do is travel back to Germany and see where they came from and trying to understand them. So research is fine. Celebration to a certain extent is certainly fine, but appropriation would be really difficult. And this idea, sometimes the Yekkes complained a bit about how they were treated, particularly in Israel, because the Hebrew wasn't good enough, and they were so typically German in a sense, always on time, always wearing jacket and tie, and they didn't really fit into this pioneering society of young, healthy, hardworking Zionists. But as a German, to complain in a way, how did you treat our emigrants, would be a rather weird thing to do. And we have this sometimes when German politicians travel to Israel, from President Heuss in the 1960s onwards. So this is indeed there and should be realized as a potential problem, I would say. And in that context, there's also a plan to build an exile museum in Berlin, which I find interesting, but at the same time also a bit weird. Isn't exile about dispersion, not about collection? How can this work? Showing documents from that immigration in the context, say, of a documentary about their immigration, about their future lives in other countries, makes a lot of sense to me. Showing them in order to reclaim them for Germany would surely be wrong. And then to the first points you made, a lot of people in Berlin have somehow been dealing with this. There's this working group for the memorial book. There's the Berlin Senate, the Senatskanzlei, so the office of the governing mayor of Berlin, who started this visiting program in 1969, invited thousands of people who came for trips where I sometimes had the opportunity to go along. Your institution, the Academy of Arts, a couple of others, also on the lower level of districts within Berlin. Some of them are very active, Schöneberg, for example. But this information has never been collated, never been brought together, and there's no address list in a way, really. I mean, and I dealt with people who were active, but maybe in their 60s or 70s in 1991. A few of them will still be around, but not very many. So a lot of this work should maybe also have been done more. Okay.
Thank you. I just wonder if, Anja, if you want to respond to Joachim's response before I go to the questions that have been collected in the chat. You don't have to, but Anja, if you want to respond to Joachim's comments, you're welcome. You're on mute, Anja.
Sorry. Sorry. I do have another question for Joachim, because I think this is a bit a question on the side, but on the other side, you have mentioned the term now, and you said that maybe it's a good term to use you said the German Jewish heritage, right?
Yeah.
And I think that is interesting, because we are in a meeting with academia from Germany and from England, and I think you would really know that, because you know both areas so well. Is it correct that German Jewish heritage is another term? It's not the same as we would say in German, das deutsch-jüdische Erbe, which means the heritage is something that is less, something that preserves. It's something that is also looking into future. And that is what you mean with the German Jewish, if you want to use it instead of German Jewish diaspora? I understood that's what you said, that maybe instead of saying German Jewish diaspora, you say the German Jewish heritage?
Well, it just came to me. I think both can be used in a way. There is very obviously, there are groups of Jews with a German background, which they partly celebrate. In that sense, you could use heritage, really. It's about literature, about music, about theater, about ways of life, folkways, children's songs, memories of the youth, and so on, that are connected to Germany. So in that sense, as long as it's preserved, people try to preserve it in such institutions as the Leobeck Institute, or also the Wiener Library in London, and many others, and not painted in too rosy colors, then I would be fine with it. And it's more or less what kulturelles Erbe, cultural heritage, I think is a notion that we can use. That the problem with German Jewish diaspora could really be that we put too much emphasis on the German aspect. These people still speak a beautiful German, that we're not able to speak such a beautiful German anymore. Yeah, this is not, yeah, maybe. That's nothing. It's not a story to be very proud of. I mean, these people had to leave Germany. These people had to leave relatives back in Germany who were then deported to their deaths. And that's part of the story. And as long as this is there, we can also talk about children's songs and about music and literature.
Yeah, I agree.
Thank you. I think we've got 4 questions, and I want to put them to Joachim in the order in which they've come in. First of all, very straightforwardly, is there an English translation being planned of your book?
Not yet, but it would of course be nice. But no plans yet.
Yeah, it's a shame. For those of us who can't read German, definitely a shame. There's a really interesting question that's come in from Maiken Umbach, which will test my lack of German pronunciation. So if you bear with me. Maiken asks a really interesting question. She says, your questions were framed around Berlin, but is there a spatial layering within the answers? Is the only reference point in the sources Berlin, or Germany, or Prussia, or Charlottenburg, Mitte, etc.? The Saltzmans, who went from Berlin to New York on the Iberia, whom Maiken has worked on, constantly reference Prussia and call themselves Die Preußen, also Kreuzberg, where they lived and worked, Berlin only very occasionally.
Yeah, that's really a fascinating question. And I think Maiken is absolutely right. It's not just Berlin. So we start really often on a local level. And that was also my experience when I had the opportunity to walk through Berlin with these invited groups. There was, say, excursion 1, Jewish Berlin, synagogues, cemeteries, libraries, other institutions, and people, yeah, okay, why not? And the other one was, we accompany you to the places of your childhood, and this is where they all wanted to go. And it's really about streets, it's about houses. On a higher level, it's really about districts, Kreuzberg, very importantly, where I also live. Schöneberg, I have mentioned. And then, of course, in these years after 1990, the eastern part of the city is at least more accessible. It was not completely inaccessible before, but now it's much more open. Weißensee Cemetery is in the eastern part. All the older buildings of the Jewish history of Berlin from the 17th to the 19th century are in Mitte, indeed. So the district level is really important. And so is indeed also Prussia. One of the first people I met in Israel was Walter Zadek. And I asked him about his Berlin connections, and he just swept them away and said, no, I'm a Prussian. And I think Prussian can refer to a number of things. On the one hand, this typical Prussian punctuality, orderliness, or that we maybe connect with it. But also a Prussia that has been social democratic until 1932, and the government was forced out already before the Nazis came to power in the whole of Germany. So there is a kind of positive attitude among some of these emigrants when we talk about Prussia. Usually, particularly in the UK and maybe in the US, we would associate Prussia with militarism and all that, but there's another layer that people often refer to indeed. But Berlin as a whole, Berlin is a symbol not for Germany, but for accessibility, openness, possibility to rise up in society, this famous move westward from the places of arrival to better housing and better living in the western parts of the city. Berlin culture is the one thing that most of them really concentrate on.
It occurred to me, if Maiken is still on the call, that you may want to respond to Joachim's answer. There's no pressure, but please just take the floor if you want to.
Yes, I'm here. Can people hear me?
Yes, I can.
Excellent.
Go ahead.
No, that was very clear. Thank you, Joachim, for the answer. I'm always very baffled by the Prussianness, and I think you're absolutely right. It's so easy to see it as part of the Sonderweg myth, and it's also referencing a social democratic tradition. The Salzmanns, who I just referenced as an example, they were both very active members of the SPD, which obviously plays into what you've just been saying. I also wonder if it's something to do with the veteran status of many of these families from the First World War. And of course, veterans networks are also very important, often in facilitating immigration and so on, that one was part of a Prussian regiment and one's sort of German patriotism is wrapped up in the memory of having served as a veteran in the First World War. Thank you.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you. I think Claire has the next question. If you want to simply ask it, Claire.
Yes. Thank you very much, Joachim. Really interesting. So I wanted to ask you to maybe share your views on a very, I don't know, well, important topic nowadays, which is digital humanities. And we are asked to think about it and how it changes our practices as historians or as researchers. And since you've dealt with both traditional sources and more, well, the digital world, I wonder if you could say how it has it added, has it changed the way you looked at these different generations? Does it allow more possibilities for comparisons, transnational approaches? Does it also bring limitations because you then focus maybe on smaller groups or on? So I don't know if you could say a few.
I think what the digital world has made possible, I mean, these 2,000 people that are members of this Yekes group on Facebook would not have met without social media, or very rarely, just some of them. But they seem to work as a group. It's a kind of protected environment in which they are able, and a moderated group, of course, in which they are able to share their documents, their memoirs, the stories. And it's easy, relatively easy on a technical level. I would never have seen all these pictures from Richard King's grandfather and all the other family pictures. I mean, Maiken has worked about photography in immigration, and family pictures is the most important thing. The moderator of the group keeps telling people, send in family pictures. This is what we want to see. We don't want to discuss politics. We want to see these pictures. But of course, this raises a number of questions. Is this now an archive? Can we treat it as an archive? No, not really. I have been doing it. I've visited it and used these documents. But what will happen to them? Luckily, fortunately, the Leobeck Institute is involved in the group, and Frank Mecklenburg's successor as chief archivist of the Leobeck Institute, Michael Simonson, is a co-moderator, and obviously he's waiting for these documents to come to him at some point. So that made it a bit easier, but obviously it doesn't replace usual archives. It doesn't replace. This is one thing I also wanted to mention. We've discussed it with Anja in preparation. Sometimes researchers go out and meet these people and ask a couple of questions and promise all kinds of things. I will bring your material to the Jewish Museum and they will, put it in a beautiful exhibition, and then they don't. And they forget about it, or it's not possible to show all these things. Obviously, there's not enough space, but it's difficult to raise too high expectations and then not be able to fulfill them. So this is a dialogue that needs to be continuous. I do write to these people from time to time, and those who don't have access to email and internet, you can still write a letter or a postcard. And you can still go to traditional archives, but there should be more collaboration, and I think it has begun between the more classical archive and the new technical possibilities. Like the Exile archive of the German National Library in Frankfurt is very active in this. It also helps us mapping, for example. We're looking at Berlin. Berlin is huge. We know about the Jewish spaces in Berlin, but I've recently been invited to see the excavations they make in what really was the very center of old Berlin. Has been destroyed in the war and then replaced by a kind of inner city motorway. And now in greener times, they want to build back the motorway and have started digging out the archaeology up to 1300 or so in 7 or 8 layers. And of course, there were houses owned by Jews. There were houses lived in by Jews. Moses Mendelssohn's house is the only one that now has been marked with the kind of memorial. But this could easily be translated into a good map online, where you then would click on the place and Moses Mendelssohn's story opens up and pictures of Mendelssohn open up and so on. This is a good development, I would say.
Anja, you want to respond?
No, I would have another short question.
Would you mind if I take the final question in the chat first?
Yes.
Just sorry. Okay, so Charlie Knight, this is question number 4. You quoted both children and adults of the 1930s in your presentation. To what extent do you think that age plays a part in this post-war relationship with Berlin? Do those who fled as children identify less or more than those who fled as adults, and as a result had more formative experiences in the city?
Okay, I start by saying that I'm very happy that Charlie is here. Charlie is my new PhD student. Tony and I will both supervise his work on, again, family letters exchanged between those who have already managed to emigrate and those who are still back in Germany or Nazi-occupied Europe, families asking about the fate of other family members. So what he will be doing, and I hope I can supervise this well, is really connect migration studies, exile research, and Holocaust studies, which I find very important. And I'm really looking forward to this. The question is difficult to respond to. I think it does play an important role, but it's not completely clear if they identify less or more. I think what you can say is that those who were small children and have not experienced anti-Semitism or violence themselves tend to remember the positive sides, positive aspects of their childhood and write about it. People who have already been adults, maybe thrown out of their job or experienced violence by neighbors or Nazi institutions, whatever, it took them surely longer to, I don't know, open up again or whatever the right word is, to such memories. But I'm afraid that I would find the opposite examples as well. My most important point, I think, it's all individual stories. It's really hundreds and thousands of individual experiences that are very difficult to categorize or bring into a kind of order. When you think of that letter, he says, Berlin, what have you done to my parents? Yeah, he still identifies with their experience, and not so much with his own. That I would be open. I would travel to Berlin. Why not? But would it be right in the understanding of my parents? I don't know.
We have time for a quick question from Anja, and then there's one more question in the chat that we'll end up with. So over to you, Anja.
It is only a very short question regarding your Yekes groups. If you know, talking about generations, if there's also the younger generations, if they're present there, if they are so interested that they would even join these groups of, what do you say, 2,000 people? Or if it's still rather the older generation, let's say 60, 70, 80 plus or something? Or do their grandchildren also join these groups?
Yeah, I think it's really a widespread. I mean, you see in the chat that Jeanette writes, some of us from the Yekes group are here in this presentation. I'm, of course, very happy about that. I think you really have everything. A lot, as she says, of people are interested in genealogy, in family history, in tracing back their family history to the places where they came from. And that often goes beyond Berlin, of course, because they arrived in Berlin from cities such as Posen or Breslau, but also from Eastern Europe and became German Jewish in this process. There are people like Richard, for example, who is, I think, more or less my age. So in a way, second generation, but there are also already younger ones. Also in the Israeli group, there's this Israeli group with a funny name, Hoppe Hoppe Reiter, which refers to a German children rhyme and song, and I think they have even 8,000 members. So there is a clear interest across the generations. Maybe there was a slight gap, as I said before, among those who are really busy building up their lives and did not want to be concerned with the past, particularly in Israel, where you, for a long period, you did not want to be concerned with the past, neither with the Holocaust, nor you with your Polish or Hungarian or whatever background. You were supposed to look to the future and build up that state. But today, I would say it's a widespread across generations.
Okay. And you pretty much responded, at least in part, to Jeanette's question, which you saw in the chat. It really has to be the last question from Maddie Walsh. What about the next generation, the children of those who emigrated from Berlin? Is there a sense of longing to claim or gain an understanding of this part of their heritage? If so, in what ways have they tried to explore this part of their identity that you've come across?
I mean, again, it is very individual. I'm sure there are people who are not at all interested in that whole story, but I don't meet them. This is something we have to keep in mind. We travel to, I don't know, Tel Aviv, or let it be New York or Los Angeles maybe, and meet these people, and then we meet the next ones in a snowball system, and we always are usually very welcome, but we don't meet those who are not interested in what we do or in their past. That's truly one point. But I would say that after that generation I've just mentioned, the next one is interested. If they claim anything, I don't know, but to gain an understanding of this part of their heritage. And again, I know more about Israel than about the other places, so maybe stick to that. Another aspect of the formation of Israeliness was, of course, to forget about all the other nesses, Germanness, Polishness, whatever. Forget where you came from. It's only important where you go to, or where we together go to. And say in the years when the existence of Israel was more endangered and not really clear if the state would survive, you would not look back so much. But with the state of Israel now more or less established, hopefully, there's more time. Now you can study Yiddish in Tel Aviv, and you can do all sorts of things related to the past, including the German Jewish past. But maybe just one more try to respond to Jeanette, pooling our knowledge and also curating our own family archives of papers and making sure that our personal archives are much more than names and dates and places. This is really a very important point. It's always connected to individual stories, to individual families. And I know that there are a very large number, but there is no real systematic approach as yet, but I'm very happy about the connection to the Leobeck Institute. So there's at least a place where people know that they can donate their materials to if they don't want to keep it in the family anymore.
Thank you. I think we've come to the end of the event, and I think you can see Joachim and Anja from the range and the engagement of the questions that you've really stimulated a lot of thought with your presentation and your very thoughtful response, Anja. So it just remains for me to, first of all, remind everybody still on the call that Claire and I have just advertised the next Parks and the next History seminars in the chat. There are registration links there. So all that is left is for me to thank you, Joachim and Anja, on behalf of Claire Lefol and everybody, I'm sure, in the meeting this evening, for a genuinely suggestive, thoughtful and fascinating set of talks. And many congratulations on the publication of your book, and I can only hope that it comes out in translation. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a good evening.
Thank you, Joan.
Cheers.